Hello everyone, and welcome to Midnight Echoes. This video is meant to help you relax, unwind, and maybe drift off to sleep. So before you get too cozy, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. So feel free to share in the comments. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you've enjoyed the episodes. I took the night shift at the convenience store for the extra pay. The hours were long and the customers were few, but it was an easy gig. Most nights, I sat behind the counter reading or scrolling through my phone. It was quiet until it wasn't. The store was located on the edge of town, a lonely spot surrounded by dark fields. The nearest building was a gas station half a mile away. My only company was the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional rumble of a passing truck. It was almost midnight when the bell above the door jingled. I looked up from my book to see a man walk in. He was tall and gaunt, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap. He didn't look at me as he wandered down the aisle. "Let me know if you need anything," I called out, trying to sound cheerful. He didn't respond. Something about him made me uneasy. His movements were deliberate, almost robotic, as he picked up a can of soup and turned it over in his hands. I pretended to go back to my book, but I couldn't help glancing at him. He wasn't shopping like a normal customer. He wasn't comparing prices or looking for something specific. He was just handling items one by one, as if trying to figure out what they were. After a few minutes, he approached the counter, placing a single candy bar in front of me. His eyes, pale and unblinking, finally met mine. "Quiet night?" he asked, his voice low and flat. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, pretty quiet." He didn't respond, just stared at me as I scanned the candy bar. His gaze was unnerving, and I found myself fumbling with the register. "That'll be $1, I said. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a handful of coins. He placed them on the counter one by one. The transaction took longer than it should have. He didn't count the coins, just placed them in a slow, deliberate rhythm. When he was done, he didn't leave. He stood there, staring at me as if waiting for something. "Anything else?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. "No," he said finally, his lips curling into a faint smile. He picked up the candy bar and walked out without another word. The bell jingled as the door closed behind him, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I watched him through the window as he stood in the parking lot, unwrapping the candy bar. He didn't eat it, just held it in his hand, staring at the store. After a minute, he turned and walked into the darkness, disappearing beyond the glow of the streetlight. The rest of the night was uneventful, but I couldn't stop thinking about him. There was something off about the way he moved, the way he stared. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the unease lingered as I locked up and went home. The next night, I was halfway through my shift when the bell jingled again. It was him. He walked in wearing the same baseball cap, the same blank expression. This time, he went straight to the counter. "Busy tonight?" he asked, his tone identical to the night before. "No," I said, trying to sound casual. "Pretty quiet, like always." He nodded slowly, then placed a pack of gum on the counter. The same ritual played out, coins placed one by one, his pale eyes fixed on me. Once again, he lingered after the transaction was complete. "Do you work alone?" he asked suddenly. My stomach tightened. "Sometimes," I lied, trying to sound indifferent. His faint smile returned. It must get lonely out here. I didn't respond, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. He didn't. He just stood there, staring. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he turned and walked out. I watched as he crossed the parking lot, his figure fading into the night. This time, I waited for a few minutes before stepping outside to lock the door. The darkness beyond the streetlight seemed impenetrable. The next day, I told my manager about the man. He shrugged it off, saying the store got all kinds of strange customers late at night. If he's not causing trouble, don't worry about it, he said. Easy for him to say. He wasn't the one working alone at midnight. That night, I felt a growing sense of dread as my shift began. I couldn't stop glancing at the clock, counting down the hours until closing. Around midnight, the bell jingled. I froze. But it wasn't him. It was a couple of teenagers looking for snacks. I relaxed a little after the teens left. Maybe he wasn't coming back. But as the clock crept closer to 1 a.m., I saw movement outside. A figure stood just beyond the glow of the streetlight, barely visible. My chest tightened as I realized it was him. He didn't come inside this time. He just stood there, watching the store. I pretended not to notice, focusing on my book, but I could feel his eyes on me. After a while, I glanced up. He was gone. The parking lot was empty, but the unease remained. When my shift ended, I walked to my car quickly, my keys clutched tightly in my hand. I scanned the dark fields surrounding the lot, half expecting him to emerge. The drive home felt longer than usual, and I checked my rearview mirror constantly, but no one followed me. The next night, I arrived at the store early, hoping to ease my nerves. I checked the security cameras to make sure they were working. The parking lot looked empty, but that only made me more uneasy. I kept glancing at the clock, dreading midnight. At exactly 12:03 a.m. a bell jingled. He was back. This time, he didn't browse. He walked straight to the counter, placing a bottle of water in front of me. Long shift? He asked, his tone oddly conversational. Yeah, I said, barely meeting his gaze. My hand shook as I rang him up. He didn't pay in coins this time. Instead, he slid a single bill across the counter, his fingers lingering on it. You should lock the door at night, he said, his voice low. My blood ran cold. I'll think about it, I said, trying to stay calm. He smiled faintly and walked out. I locked the door as soon as he left, my heart pounding in my chest. Through the window, I watched him stand in the parking lot again, staring at the store. After a few minutes, he turned and walked into the darkness. I didn't unlock the door for the rest of the night. The following night, I convinced my manager to let me work with another employee. Sarah, a college student, agreed to cover the shift with me. Her presence made me feel safer, though I didn't tell her why I'd requested the help. I didn't want to sound paranoid. Around midnight, the bell jingled. It was him. Sarah greeted him cheerfully, but he didn't respond. He wandered the aisles, his movement slower than usual. I kept my eyes on him, my grip tightening on the edge of the counter. He didn't buy anything this time. He just left. As soon as the door closed, Sarah turned to me. What's his deal? She asked, frowning. I don't know, I said honestly. He comes here almost every night. Sarah shook her head. Creepy. You should report him. I nodded, but deep down, I doubted it would help. The next few nights, Sarah continued to join me on the shift. The man didn't return, and I started to feel like things were going back to normal. I even began sleeping better. But on the 5th night, everything changed. The bell jingled just before closing. It wasn't him this time. It was a different man, older and disheveled, with wild eyes that darted around the store. He approached the counter, leaning in closer than necessary. Have you seen him? He whispered. I exchanged a glance with Sarah. Seen who? I asked cautiously. The man in the cap, he said urgently. He's not what he seems. Don't trust him. My heart raced as the man's gaze shifted to the door. He'll come back, he muttered before walking out. Sarah locked the door immediately, her face pale. What was that about? She asked. I didn't have an answer. The rest of the shift was tense. We kept the door locked, only opening it for customers we recognized. The older man's words echoed in my mind. I replayed every interaction I'd had with the man in the cap, trying to make sense of it. What wasn't he seeming? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of my apartment made me jump. Around 3 a.m. my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You shouldn't have listened to him," it read. My blood ran cold as I stared at the screen. How did he get my number? I called Sarah immediately, waking her up. "He texted me," I said, my voice shaking. "Who?" she asked grudgingly. "The man in the cap," I said. "He knows my number." Sarah tried to reassure me, but her voice wavered. "Call the police," she said. "Now." The police took my statement, but without proof, there wasn't much they could do. "Change your number," the officer suggested, "and let us know if he contacts you again." I didn't feel reassured. The man in the cap was always one step ahead. He wasn't just watching, he was planning. I quit the night shift the next day. Sarah understood, though she decided to keep working. I moved to a different city, hoping to start fresh. But even now, every time I pass a convenience store, I check the parking lot. Somewhere out there, he's still watching. Next story. It all started with a simple ad on a local buy and sell group. I had an old camera to get rid of, a Nikon DSLR that I hadn't used in years. A buyer messaged me within minutes. Interested. "Can meet tonight?" Their profile seemed normal enough, a man named Greg, living nearby. The speed of the reply felt too convenient, but I was eager to sell. We agreed to meet at a nearby gas station, a public spot that felt safe. I arrived early, clutching the camera case nervously. The parking lot was brightly lit, but mostly empty. After 10 minutes, a black sedan pulled in, parking a few spaces away. The driver didn't get out, and I couldn't make out his face. I approached cautiously, waving to signal I was the seller. The window rolled down just enough for a voice to call out. "You got the camera?" It was deep and raspy. "Yeah," I replied, holding up the bag. "Can I see the cash first?" A hand emerged, holding a small envelope. The situation felt off, but I tried to stay calm. As I moved closer, the car's engine revved slightly. "Put it in the back seat," the voice instructed. My stomach twisted. "I'd rather you step out," I said firmly, taking a step back. The hand disappeared, and the car sped off without another word. My heart raced as I stood there, alone in the empty lot. Back home, I was shaken but relieved the encounter hadn't escalated. I posted a warning in the group about the buyer, but the account was already deactivated. The next morning, a new message appeared in my inbox. "Still have the camera? I can pick it up today." The profile picture was different, but something about the phrasing felt eerily familiar. I ignored the message, but they persisted. "Name your price. I'll pay double if you deliver." I blocked the account, hoping that would be the end of it. But later that evening, I received a text on my phone. "Nice camera. Shame, it's collecting dust." My blood ran cold. I hadn't shared my number with anyone. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a coincidence or someone I'd forgotten messaging. But when I checked the group, the ad was gone, deleted without my consent. The unease settled deep in my chest. Someone had my information, and they were making it clear they wanted to stay anonymous. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. My email flooded with spam, all referencing cameras and photography. Packages I didn't order began showing up at my door: tripods, lenses, even a vintage camera. The return addresses were blank. It was as if someone was taunting me. I contacted the platform support team, but they were dismissive. Probably just a glitch, they said. Frustrated, I called my phone provider to report the harassment. The representative put me on hold, and when they returned, their tone had shifted. "Ma'am, your number has been flagged in multiple international databases." "What does that mean?" I asked. panic rising. They explained that my phone number had been used in various phishing scams over the last month. "Have you shared your number publicly?" they asked. My mind flashed back to the buy and sell group. It had to be connected. I changed my number immediately. For a week, things seemed to quiet down. Then one night, I received an email from an unknown address. The subject line read, "I miss our chats." Attached was a photo of me, taken through my living room window. My breath hitched as I recognized the shirt I'd worn earlier that evening. I called the police, but they were frustratingly unhelpful. Without proof of who had taken the photo, there was little they could do. "Install cameras," one officer suggested, "and keep your curtains closed." I spent the rest of the night checking every lock, feeling more vulnerable than ever. The next morning, I noticed footprints in the dirt outside my window. They led to the back gate, which was slightly ajar. I installed a motion-activated camera that day, pointing it toward the yard. That night, the camera pinged me with an alert. My heart sank as I opened the app. The footage showed a man in a dark hoodie standing at the gate. He didn't move, didn't try to enter, just stood there, staring toward the house. His face was obscured, but the outline was familiar. It was him, the buyer from the parking lot. I felt sick. I shared the footage with the police, but their response was the same. "He didn't commit a crime by standing there," they said. "Let us know if he tries to enter." Their indifference was maddening. I decided to take matters into my own hands, buying additional cameras and even a second lock for the gate. A week passed without incident. I started to feel a sliver of relief, thinking maybe he had moved on. But then I woke up to find a package on my porch. No label, no sender, just a plain cardboard box. Inside was my old camera, with a note taped to it. "You forgot this." I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I packed the bag and drove to a friend's place, explaining the situation. They agreed to let me stay while I sorted things out. For the first time in weeks, I felt safe. But that night, I received another email. "Running won't help." The email included another attachment, a video this time. It showed me leaving my house, dragging my suitcase to the car. The camera angle was low, as if it had been filmed from the bushes. My hand shook as I deleted the email, realizing there was nowhere I could hide. The next morning, I returned home with a plan to sell the house and leave town for good. But as I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something chilling. The lock on the gate was broken, and the front door was slightly open. My stomach churned as I stepped inside. The house was eerily silent. Every light was on, and the air felt heavy. In the living room, I found a chair placed in the center of the room. On it was a laptop, its screen glowing. A single video was queued up. Against my better judgment, I hit play. The video began with a view of my house, recorded from outside. The timestamp showed it was filmed the night before. The camera zoomed in on my window, where I could see myself sitting on the couch. My breath hitched as the video cut to another angle inside my house. Someone had been filming me from the hallway. My hands trembled as the footage continued. It showed me sleeping in bed, completely unaware. The camera panned to the closet, and the door opened slowly, revealing a dark figure standing inside. The video ended abruptly with a single frame of text. "We need to talk." I stumbled back, nearly knocking over the chair. My mind raced. Whoever had done this wasn't just watching me. They'd been inside, close enough to touch me while I slept. I grabbed the laptop and drove straight to the police station, determined to make them take it seriously this time. The officers reviewed the footage, their expressions growing grim. "We'll assign someone to watch the house," one of them said, though his tone wasn't reassuring. "Do you recognize the person?" I shook my head. The figure was too obscured, but I knew in my gut it was the man from the parking lot. For the next few nights, an officer parked outside my house. It helped me sleep a little easier, though the anxiety never fully left. On the third night, the officer knocked on my door, holding a small device. "Found this near your back gate," he said. "It's a hidden camera." The discovery made my skin crawl. Someone had been monitoring my every move, even with the police presence. They reviewed the footage from the hidden camera and found hours of recordings, mostly uneventful. But one clip stood out. It showed a man planting the device, his hood obscuring his face. The timestamp on the video was from a week ago, the night before I installed my own cameras. It meant he'd been one step ahead the entire time. The police promised to increase patrols, but I could tell they were reaching the limits of what they could do. My trust in their ability to protect me was dwindling. I decided to sell the house immediately, contacting a realtor the next morning. As I packed my belongings, I found another package in the mailbox. This time, it contained a printed photo of the police car parked outside my house. The message on the back read, "You think they can stop me?" The photo shattered any remaining sense of security. Whoever this was, they weren't afraid of the police. They wanted me to feel helpless, and it was working. I stayed with a friend for the next few days, avoiding my house entirely. But even there, I felt like I was being watched. The final straw came when I received another email. This one included a single sentence, "Check your car." My blood ran cold as I walked outside. On the windshield, I found a note taped under the wiper. It read, "See you soon." That was the moment I decided to leave for good. I sold the house at a loss, packed what little I could fit in my car, and left the city. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my closest friends. I wanted to disappear completely, to start fresh in a place where no one could find me. But the fear never left. Months later, in a new town, I began to feel a fragile sense of peace. I avoided social media, kept my phone number private, and made a point of staying under the radar. For a while, it seemed to work. The strange emails and packages stopped, and the nightmares began to fade. But one morning, I found something that made my heart drop. Tucked under my new front door was a photograph of me, taken at a grocery store 2 days earlier. Written on the back were 3 words, "Found you again." My hand shook as I realized the truth. He was never going to stop. I packed my bag and drove to the police station, the photograph clutched in my hand. "I need help," I told the officer at the desk. But even as I handed over the evidence, a chilling thought struck me. No matter where I went, he'd always be watching. Now, I live in a constant state of fear, always looking over my shoulder. The police have my case on file, but I know they can't stop him. He's out there, waiting for the right moment to strike. Every time I check my email or hear a knock at the door, I wonder if this time it will be the end. Next story. It was past midnight when I pulled into the downtown parking lot. I had stayed late at the office to finish a project, and now the streets were nearly deserted. The parking lot was dimly lit, with most of its spaces empty. I parked close to the exit, eager to get home. That was when I saw him, the lot attendant. He was sitting in the booth near the entrance, his silhouette faintly visible through the glass. Something about his stillness unsettled me. Normally, attendants waved or acknowledged you as you drove in, but he just sat there, motionless. I grabbed my bag and tried not to think about it. As I locked my car, I felt eyes on me. I glanced toward the booth, and sure enough, the attendant was staring. His face was partially obscured by shadows, but I could make out the pale glint of his eyes. I looked away quickly, my pulse quickening. It was probably nothing, I told myself. The elevator to the street level felt claustrophobic. As the doors opened, I glanced back toward the booth. He was still staring. The cold night air hit me as I stepped out onto the sidewalk, and I quickened my pace, trying to shake the feeling of unease. I told myself to stop overthinking. The walk to my apartment wasn't far, 10 minutes at most, but every step felt longer than usual. The streets were eerily quiet, and the sound of my shoes on the pavement seemed deafening. I resisted the urge to look over my shoulder, though I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. When I reached my building, I fumbled with my keys, glancing around nervously. The street was empty. Still, I rushed inside, locking the door behind me. My apartment felt safe, its familiar walls comforting. I set down my bag and tried to laugh off my paranoia. It had been a long day. As I got ready for bed, I checked my phone. There was a text from an unknown number. "You forgot something in your car," it read. My stomach dropped. I hadn't spoken to anyone at the lot, let alone given out my number. I stared at the message, trying to rationalize it. I replied cautiously, "Who is this?" The response came almost instantly. The attendant. My hands shook as I stared at the screen. How had he gotten my number? I thought about calling the police, but decided against it. Maybe it was a prank. I turned off my phone and went to bed. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the apartment seemed louder, every shadow darker. Around 3 a.m., I heard a faint knock at the door. I froze, my heart pounding. The knock came again, louder this time. I grabbed my phone, debating whether to answer or call for help. Through the peephole, I saw nothing. The hallway was empty. I waited, holding my breath, but the knocking didn't return. After a long moment, I crept back to bed, though sleep was impossible. Every noise set my nerves on edge, and I stayed awake until the first light of dawn. The next morning, I checked my car before heading to work. Everything seemed fine, no scratches, no signs of tampering. But when I opened the door, I found a single piece of paper on the seat. Written in neat, blocky letters were the words, "We need to talk." I looked around the lot, but there was no sign of the attendant or anyone else. My pulse raced as I got into the car and drove to work. I couldn't focus all day, replaying the events in my mind. I debated reporting it to someone, but hesitated. What would I even say? That evening, I parked in a different lot, hoping to avoid the attendant altogether. As I walked to my apartment, my phone buzzed. Another text from the unknown number. "You can't hide." I stopped in my tracks, my blood running cold. He was watching me, but from where? I ran the rest of the way home, locking the door behind me. My hands shook as I called the building manager, asking if anyone had reported strange activity. "Not that I've heard," he said casually. I didn't mention the attendant, unsure if it would make a difference. For the next few days, I tried to change my routine, packing in different lots and taking different routes home. But no matter what I did, the texts kept coming. "Nice shirt. Late again. Forgot your coffee." Each one referenced something I'd done that day, proving he was always nearby. The breaking point came when I found another note, this time taped to my apartment door. It was the same neat handwriting. "Let's meet." I called the police, finally convinced this wasn't something I could handle alone. An officer arrived within the hour, taking my statement and a note. The officer seemed skeptical. "You haven't seen him enter the building?" he asked. I shook my head. "No, but he's been outside watching." The officer promised to patrol the area and suggested installing a camera. It was something, but it didn't feel like enough. That night, I stayed with a friend, unable to face the apartment alone. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. Another text. "Running won't help." My stomach churned as I showed the message to my friend. "You need to get out of there," she said, her voice shaking. I nodded, already planning my next move. The next day, I packed my things and moved to a temporary rental across town. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my closest friends. For a while, it seemed to work. The text stopped and I began to feel normal again. But it didn't last. One evening, as I returned to the rental, I noticed something off. The lock on the door felt loose, as if it had been tampered with. Inside, Everything seemed untouched, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. My paranoia returned full force. That night, I installed a camera inside the rental, pointing toward the front door. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had tampered with the lock might come back. As I reviewed the footage the next morning, my stomach dropped. At 3:14 Hamas, a man in a dark jacket tried the handle and then looked directly into the camera. His face was obscured by the hood, but I knew it was him. The way he tilted his head, the deliberate slowness of his movements, it was exactly how the parking lot attendant had acted. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, there was no trace of him. The officer who reviewed the footage gave me the same advice as before. Change your routine, install more security, and stay vigilant. It wasn't enough. I couldn't stay here. I packed my bags once again, this time leaving the city entirely. I didn't have a plan, just a need to disappear. I ended up in a small town 2 hours away, renting a room in a quiet inn. The first week passed peacefully, and I started to believe I'd finally escaped him. But one morning, as I walked back from the grocery store, I noticed a familiar car parked near the inn. A black sedan. I froze, watching the car from a distance. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside. As I approached cautiously, the engine started, and the car drove off slowly. My heart pounded as I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence. But I knew better. That night, I kept all the lights on and barely slept. At 2 my phone buzzed with a new text. Nice town, quiet. I dropped the phone, my hands trembling. He had found me again. The fear was suffocating, and I realized there was no escaping him, not like this. I decided to take a drastic step. I contacted a private investigator, explaining everything that had happened. He listened intently, nodding as I showed him the notes and footage. "This guy isn't random," he said. "He's targeting you specifically. We need to figure out why." The investigator began digging into the parking lot's history and the attendant's identity. Days passed without any new incidents, and I began to feel a sliver of hope. Then, one afternoon, the investigator called me. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "The man you're describing? He doesn't work there." I frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" I asked. "The lot's owner confirmed they haven't had an attendant in months," he said. "That booth has been empty since last year." My mind raced. If he wasn't an employee, who was he? And why had he chosen me? The investigator uncovered something chilling. A man matching the description of the attendant had been involved in multiple stalking cases across the state. In each case, he targeted individuals who frequented public places alone, leaving them cryptic messages before disappearing without a trace. I was just his latest target. Armed with this information, the investigator worked with the police to trace the texts and emails. The messages led to an abandoned building on the outskirts of town. Officers searched the premises but found nothing, just an empty room with a chair and a pile of shredded papers. He had been there, but he was always one step ahead. The police assured me they were doing everything they could, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even in the quiet town, I avoided going out after dark. My nerves were frayed, and I jumped at every sound. The thought of him out there, still watching, consumed me. Weeks passed without any new incidents, and I began to hope that it was finally over. Then, one morning, I found a package on my doorstep. My heart sank as I opened it. Inside was a single item, the first note he had ever left me. "We need to talk." I called the investigator in a panic. "He's back," I said, my voice shaking. "He knows where I am." The investigator arrived that afternoon, bringing security equipment and a plan to catch him in the act. For the first time, I felt like I had a chance to fight back. That night, we waited. Cameras were set up, and I stayed inside while the investigator monitored the feed. At 2:14 AM, he appeared lingering near the edge of the property. The investigator called the police, and for once, they arrived in time. He was caught. But even as they took him away, his eyes never left mine. "See you soon," he whispered. Next story. It began as a casual exploration. My friend Tim and I were bored on a Saturday night, wandering the city with nothing to do. He suggested checking out the storm drain tunnel under Monroe Street, a place infamous for graffiti and urban legends. I was hesitant but agreed. What else was there to do? We reached the entrance, a jagged concrete opening surrounded by overgrown weeds. The air smelled damp, and the sound of rushing water echoed faintly from inside. Tim grinned, holding up his flashlight. "You scared?" he teased. I rolled my eyes and followed him in, ducking to avoid hitting my head. The tunnel was narrower than I expected, with slimy walls and ankle-deep water. Tim walked ahead, his flashlight beam bouncing off the graffiti-covered walls. Most of it was harmless tags and amateur art, but occasionally we'd see something darker. A crude drawing of a figure with X's for eyes caught my attention. "Creepy," I muttered, shining my light on the figure. Tim glanced back. "That? It's nothing. People love adding fake horror stuff to places like this." I nodded, trying to ignore the chill creeping up my spine. We kept walking, our footsteps sloshing loudly in the shallow water. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the air felt. The tunnel seemed endless, the faint sound of traffic above growing more distant. Tim stopped abruptly, his light fixed on something ahead. "What is that?" he whispered. I followed his gaze and saw a pile of rags slumped against the wall. At first, I thought it was just garbage, but as we got closer, I realized it was a person, a man, hunched over and motionless. His clothes were filthy, and his head was bowed. Tim and I exchanged uneasy glances. "Let's turn back," I said quietly. Tim hesitated but nodded. We started walking back, moving faster this time. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting the man to follow. The tunnel felt darker now, the graffiti on the walls more sinister. "Did you see his hands?" Tim asked suddenly. "They were wrong?" I hadn't noticed, and I didn't want to ask. The sound of sloshing water behind us made me freeze. I turned, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The man was standing now, his figure barely visible in the distance. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. "Go," I whispered to Tim. "Now." We broke into a jog, the sound of our footsteps echoing loudly. The tunnel seemed longer than before, the exit nowhere in sight. I glanced back again. The man was following us, his pace deliberate. My chest tightened as I realized he was closing the distance. Tim tripped, nearly falling into the water. I grabbed his arm, pulling him upright. "Keep going," I shouted. The man's footsteps grew louder, the splashing water now unmistakable. My legs ached as I pushed myself to run faster, desperate to reach the exit. Finally, the faint glow of the streetlights appeared ahead. "There!" Tim shouted. We sprinted toward the opening, scrambling up the slope and onto the pavement. I turned back, my flashlight scanning the tunnel. The man had stopped just inside, his silhouette barely visible in the shadows. He didn't step into the light, but I could feel his eyes on us. "Let's go," I said, my voice shaking. Tim didn't argue. We left the tunnel behind, jogging all the way to Tim's car. My heart was still racing as we climbed in and locked the doors. We didn't speak much on the drive home. Every shadow we passed felt like it could be him, lurking, waiting. When Tim dropped me off, I made sure all the doors and windows were locked before heading to bed. I told myself it was over, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. The next morning, I woke to find muddy footprints on my porch. My stomach dropped as I stared at them. They led from the sidewalk to my front door, then back again. I checked the locks. Everything was secure. but the thought of him standing there made my skin crawl. I called Tim, hoping for reassurance. "It's probably just kids messing around," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Let's just forget about it." I agreed, though my gut told me it wasn't that simple. That night, I barely slept, every creak of the house setting me on edge. Over the next few days, I noticed strange things. The motion light in my backyard kept turning on, even when there was no one there. My trash cans were moved, their lids left open. Once, I found a crumpled piece of paper on my doorstep. It had no message, just a dirty handprint. I installed cameras around the house, hoping to catch whoever was doing this. The first night, I stayed up late watching the live feed. For hours, nothing happened. But around 2 May, the motion light flickered on. The camera caught a figure standing at the edge of my yard. It was him, the man from the tunnel. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, his face just out of view. Then, slowly, he stepped back into the shadows. My hand shook as I saved the footage. This wasn't a prank. He was stalking me. I took the footage to the police the next morning. They listened to my story, but seemed skeptical. "He hasn't done anything illegal," one officer said. "We'll keep an eye on your area." It wasn't the reassurance I needed. I felt helpless, knowing he was still out there. Tim came over that night, insisting we confront the man ourselves. "We'll go back to the tunnel," he said. "Scare him off." It was a terrible idea, but I was desperate for closure. We armed ourselves with flashlights and headed back, the city eerily quiet around us. The tunnel looked even more foreboding at night. The graffiti seemed to shift under the beam of our flashlights, and the air was colder than I remembered. "Let's get this over with," I muttered. Tim nodded, his usual confidence noticeably absent. We stepped inside, the sound of our footsteps echoing. We moved deeper into the tunnel, scanning the walls for any sign of him. The water was higher than before, and the stench of decay was stronger. "Maybe he's gone," Tim whispered, though it sounded more like a question. I was about to agree when we heard a faint scraping sound ahead. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The sound grew louder, accompanied by slow, deliberate footsteps. "He's here," I whispered, my throat dry. Tim motioned for me to stay back as he crept forward. "Hey," he called out. "We know you're here. Leave us alone." The footsteps stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Then, from the darkness, a low voice echoed. "You shouldn't have come back." My chest tightened as the figure stepped into view. His face was gaunt, his clothes soaked and tattered. He held something in his hand, a rusted metal pipe. "Stay where you are," Tim shouted, raising his flashlight like a weapon. The man didn't listen. He moved closer, his eyes fixed on us. "I live here," he said, his voice uneven. "You don't belong." His grip on the pipe tightened, and I realized we needed to run. "Tim, go," I yelled. We turned and bolted, splashing through the water as the man's footsteps thundered behind us. My heart pounded as I pushed myself to run faster, the exit growing closer. "Don't stop," I shouted, glancing back. He was right behind us, his face twisted with rage. We burst out of the tunnel and onto the street, gasping for air. I turned to see if he had followed, but the entrance was empty. The man was gone, swallowed by the darkness. "Let's get out of here," Tim said, his voice shaking. We didn't need to be told twice. Back at my house, we sat in silence, trying to process what had happened. "He's dangerous," Tim said finally. "You need to move," I nodded, knowing he was right. The man wasn't going to stop until he felt we had paid for invading his space. The thought made my skin crawl. The next morning, I started packing. Tim offered to help, but I told him I needed to handle it alone. As I loaded boxes into my car, I felt a pair of eyes on me. I turned quickly, but no one was there. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. That night, I stayed at a motel on the outskirts of town. The room was small, but felt safer than my house. As I lay in bed, my phone buzzed. I hesitated before picking it up. The message was from an unknown number. "You can't run from me." My stomach churned as I stared at the screen. He had found me, even here. I called the police again, desperate for help. They promised to send someone to the motel, but by the time they arrived, the parking lot was empty. I showed them the message, but there was little they could do. The next day, I moved to a different motel without telling anyone. I stayed inside, keeping the blinds shut and the doors locked. For a while, it seemed to work. The messages stopped, and I began to feel a small sense of relief. But that night, everything changed. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside my room. They were slow, deliberate, and stopped just outside the door. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone, ready to call for help. Then came the knock, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the room. I froze, too scared to move. The knock came again, louder this time. "I know you're in there," the man's voice said, muffled by the door. I held my breath, praying he would leave. After a long moment, the footsteps retreated. I stayed up all night, clutching a kitchen knife, waiting for him to return. The police caught him 2 days later. He had been living in the storm drain for years, targeting anyone who came too close. They found my address and his belongings, along with photos of my house. I moved far away after that, but the memory of his voice still haunts me. "You don't belong." Next story. I always took the same route home from my night shifts. The overpass on Mill Road was the quickest way to get to my apartment. It wasn't the safest area, but I stuck to well-lit paths and kept my keys between my fingers, just in case. I'd never had a reason to be afraid until last Thursday. It was nearly midnight when I left work, my feet dragging after a long shift. The overpass loomed ahead, its dull concrete illuminated by dim streetlights. The city was unusually quiet, the usual hum of traffic replaced by an eerie stillness. I pulled my coat tighter as a cold breeze swept through the street. Halfway across the overpass, I noticed something odd. A man was leaning against the railing, his face hidden in the shadow of a baseball cap. He didn't move as I approached, didn't even look in my direction. My pace slowed, and I considered crossing to the other side of the street. I decided to keep going, telling myself not to overreact. As I passed him, I glanced briefly in his direction. He was staring straight ahead, his posture unnervingly rigid. I quickened my steps, my heartbeat accelerating. He didn't follow, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something about him was wrong. The rest of the walk home was uneventful, but I couldn't stop replaying the encounter in my mind. Who stands motionless on an overpass at midnight? The thought lingered as I locked my apartment door behind me. I checked the locks twice before heading to bed, uneasy but unsure why. The next night, I took the same route, hoping the man wouldn't be there. The overpass was empty, and I let out a small sigh of relief. But as I reached the midpoint, I saw something on the ground. A single cigarette butt, still faintly smoldering. My stomach tightened. I scanned the area, my eyes darting to every shadow. The overpass seemed deserted, but the cigarette was fresh. Someone had been there moments ago. My hands trembled as I gripped my keys tighter, speeding up my pace. I didn't stop looking over my shoulder until I reached my apartment. The next few nights, I avoided the overpass, taking the longer route home. It added 10 minutes to my walk, but the extra time was worth the peace of mind. By Saturday, I started to feel silly for being so paranoid. The city was full of strange people. He was probably harmless. On Sunday night, I decided to take the overpass again. The wind was bitterly cold, and I didn't want to be outside longer than necessary. As I neared the overpass, I noticed a faint glow ahead. Someone was there, smoking. My heart sank as I recognized the figure leaning on the railing. I stopped several feet away, debating whether to turn around. The man didn't acknowledge me, but the tension in the air was palpable. I forced myself to keep walking, my footsteps echoing loudly. As I passed, I felt his gaze shift toward me, though he didn't say a word. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made me jump, and I kept imagining him standing outside my window. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but the unease wouldn't go away. I decided to change my schedule the next day, leaving work earlier to avoid the late-night walk. Leaving work at 10 p.m. felt safer, but the overpass was still unsettlingly empty. As I crossed, I noticed faint scuff marks on the pavement, like someone had been dragging their feet. I tried to ignore it, but my paranoia was growing. Was he following me without my noticing? That night, I installed a door alarm on my apartment and left the hallway light on. I told myself it was just for peace of mind, but deep down, I felt like I was being hunted. The next morning, I considered taking a cab home after work, but the cost made me hesitate. Tuesday night, the overpass was empty again, and I started to feel like maybe it had all been in my head. As I reached the midpoint, I noticed something new. A piece of paper taped to the railing. My name was written on it in messy block letters. My blood ran cold. I ripped the paper off the railing, scanning my surroundings. The street below was dark and quiet, and there was no sign of anyone nearby. I didn't stop to read the note until I was safely inside my apartment. It read, "You walk too fast." My hand shook as I stared at the note. How did he know my name? The thought made my skin crawl. I called the police, but their response was underwhelming. "Unless he's threatened you, there's not much we can do," the officer said. I felt helpless. The following night, I took the long route again, avoiding the overpass entirely. But as I reached my apartment, I found another note taped to my door. It was the same messy handwriting, and this time it read, "Don't try to hide." I felt sick to my stomach. I contacted my landlord and asked to review the security footage. The cameras facing the entrance had caught nothing unusual. Whoever left the note must have avoided the cameras entirely. The idea that he was watching me so closely made my chest tighten with fear. The next few days were quiet, but the sense of being watched never left. Every time I passed a shadowy alley or an empty street, I expected to see him. Then, on Friday night, I spotted something that froze me in place, a figure standing across the street from my building. He wasn't hiding this time. The man stood perfectly still, his face obscured by the shadow of his cap. I backed away from the window, my hands trembling. When I looked again, he was gone, but the feeling of dread remained. I didn't leave my apartment for the rest of the weekend. By Monday, I knew I couldn't keep living like this. I took a cab to work, avoiding the overpass entirely. My coworkers asked if I was okay, noticing how distracted I'd become. I lied and said I wasn't sleeping well. The truth was harder to explain without sounding paranoid. That night, I asked the cab to drop me off 2 blocks from my apartment. As I walked the last stretch, I checked every corner, every shadow. The street was empty, and for the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of relief. But when I reached my door, I froze. There was another note taped to the door, the same messy handwriting as before. This one was shorter. "I'm patient." My heart raced as I ripped it down and rushed inside. I locked every door and window, my hands shaking. Whoever he wasn't going to stop. I called the police again, this time begging them to take me seriously. They sent an officer to take a report, but their tone was the same as before. Without physical harm or direct threats, there wasn't much they could do. "Install cameras," they said. I felt helpless. That night, I barely slept. Around 3 a.m. I heard something outside my window, a faint shuffling sound. I didn't dare look, instead clutching my phone in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. The sound faded after a few minutes, but the fear lingered. The next morning, I found muddy footprints leading from the sidewalk to my window. I showed the police, but they said the same thing. No crime has been committed. It felt like a cruel joke. I couldn't stay here anymore. I started looking for new apartments that afternoon. By Wednesday, I had packed up most of my belongings. I arranged to stay with a friend while I figured out my next move. That night, as I loaded boxes into my car, I felt that same chilling sensation of being watched. When I turned, the street was empty, but I knew he was there. I stayed with my friend for a week, avoiding my apartment entirely. She tried to comfort me, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. "Are you sure it's not just random?" she asked. I didn't answer. I knew it wasn't random. He was targeting me, and he wasn't going to stop. The final straw came on Friday night. My friend and I returned from dinner to find a note taped to her door. It was the same messy handwriting. "You're not safe." My friend's face went pale. "We're calling the police," she said firmly. I nodded, my throat dry. The police arrived quickly, but as always, there was little they could do. The officer advised us to stay somewhere else for the night. We checked into a motel, trying to calm our nerves. I didn't sleep, my mind racing with thoughts of what he might do next. The next morning, I received a text from an unknown number. It was a picture of my friend's front door, taken that night. The message read, "You can't run forever." I showed it to the police, but their response was frustratingly familiar. "We're doing everything we can," they said. Desperate for answers, I began researching similar cases online. I found a forum thread about a man who stalked his victims for months before disappearing without a trace. The details were eerily similar: notes, footprints, late-night appearances. The thread had one chilling conclusion: he never stopped watching. That evening, I decided to face him. I returned to my apartment, leaving the blinds open and the lights on. I sat by the window, waiting. Hours passed, and then, around midnight, I saw him. He stood across the street, his cap pulled low, his body motionless. My chest tightened. I picked up my phone, dialing the police as I stared him down. He didn't move, didn't flinch. The operator assured me an officer was on the way, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. They searched the area but found nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I moved out the next day, leaving the city behind. Months later, I still feel his presence. Every shadow, every unknown number, sends a shiver down my spine. I don't know where he is or if he'll ever come back, but one thing is certain: he's still watching. Next story. It was past midnight when I boarded the last train home. The station was eerily quiet, the usual hum of commuters replaced by the distant sound of rats scurrying on the tracks. I hesitated before stepping onto the empty car. I didn't have a choice. It was either this or a 2-hour walk home. The train doors hissed shut behind me, and the car jolted forward. I chose a seat near the middle, keeping my back to the wall. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting the dull gray interior in a sickly glow. I glanced around. I was alone, or so I thought. As the train moved through the dark tunnels, I heard the faint creak of metal. I assumed it was the train settling into its tracks, but then it came again, a soft, deliberate sound, like someone shifting their weight. My pulse quickened. Was I truly alone? I turned slowly, scanning the car. At first, I saw nothing unusual. But then, toward the far end, a figure emerged from the shadows. A man sat slouched in a seat, his face obscured by a hood. I hadn't noticed him when I boarded. My throat tightened. He didn't move, didn't look at me. He just sat there, unnervingly still. I debated whether to switch cars at the next stop, but the train didn't stop. The lights flickered again, and I realized we were between stations, trapped in the endless tunnel. The man shifted slightly, his head tilting just enough to reveal part of his face. His skin was pale, almost waxy, and his eyes half-lidded seemed unfocused. I told myself he was probably just a drunk commuter, but the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. I stared out the window, trying to ignore him, but the reflection in the glass betrayed his movements. He was standing now, swaying slightly with the motion of the train. My heart pounded as I realized he was walking toward me, slow and deliberate. I clenched my fists, my mind racing. What did he want? I avoided eye contact, hoping he'd pass by, but he stopped a few feet away. "Late night, huh?" he said, his voice raspy. I nodded stiffly, not trusting myself to speak. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "You don't look like you belong on this train," he said, his tone conversational but tinged with something darker. I forced a nervous laugh. "Just heading home," I replied. He tilted his head, studying me like a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "Home," he repeated, almost mockingly. I glanced toward the door, willing the train to reach the next station. But the intercom crackled, and a robotic voice announced a delay due to technical difficulties. The man's grin widened. "Guess we're stuck," he said, taking a step closer. My stomach churned. I reached for my phone, pretending to check messages, but there was no signal. He noticed and chuckled softly. "No use," he said. "We're underground. No one can hear us." My fingers tightened around the phone as I debated whether to run or stay seated. The man suddenly sat down across from me, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Do you believe in fate?" he asked, his voice low. I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. "I guess," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. His grin faded into a blank stare. "I think it's fate that we met tonight," he continued, his tone almost reflective. Two strangers on an empty train. My palms were sweaty as I nodded, trying to appear calm. "Yeah, crazy coincidence." He didn't laugh. Instead, he reached into his pocket. My breath caught as he pulled out a small folding knife. He didn't open it, just turned it over in his hands, studying it. "You know, most people are too scared to talk to me," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "But you're not, are you?" I didn't answer, my mind racing through possible escape routes. The doors were locked, and there was no one else to call for help. The man tilted his head again, as if waiting for a reaction. "You're different," he said finally. "I like that." The train lurched to a stop, the lights dimming briefly. The intercom announced that we were at an unscheduled halt, but the doors remained closed. I took the chance to stand, my legs shaky. "I think I'll move to another car," I said, trying to sound casual. His smile vanished. "I don't think that's a good idea," he said, standing as well. My heart pounded as I backed toward the door. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He took a step closer, his knife now in his hand. "Trouble?" he repeated, almost laughing. "You think I'm trouble?" The knife gleamed under the flickering lights, and I knew I had to act fast. I lunged for the emergency door release, yanking it hard. The mechanism hissed, and the door slid open just enough for me to slip through. I ran into the next car, slamming the door shut behind me. My hand shook as I fumbled with the lock. Through the glass, I saw him standing there, his expression blank. He tapped the knife against the window once, twice, then turned and walked away. The train finally started moving, and I collapsed into a seat, my body trembling. When we reached the next station, I bolted out of the car, my eyes scanning for station security. The platform was empty. I reported the incident the next day, but the police said the cameras had been malfunctioning. Days later, I found a note in my mailbox. It was a single sentence, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "We'll meet again." I stared at the note, my stomach twisting into knots. How had he found me? My name wasn't listed, and I lived miles from the train station. I tried to convince myself it was a cruel prank, that deep down, I knew it was him. He wanted me to know that he wasn't done. I stayed home for the next few days, barely eating or sleeping. Every knock at the door made my heart race. I installed extra locks, even put a chair under the handle at night. But the fear stayed. The thought of him being out there, watching, was suffocating. The next time I left the house was to go to work. I decided to take a cab, avoiding the subway entirely. It was expensive, but worth it for my peace of mind. As the cab sped through the city, I found myself scanning the streets, searching for his face in every crowd. Work was uneventful, and for a moment, I felt normal again. But as I exited the building that evening, my heart sank. Across the street, leaning against a lamppost, was a man in a hooded jacket. He wasn't looking at me, but I knew it was him. I hurried back inside. I called the police, explaining everything again. This time, they took me seriously. An officer arrived to escort me home, but when we reached the spot where the man had been, he was gone. The officer assured me they patrolled the area, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. That night, I couldn't relax. I double-checked the locks, turned off all the lights, and sat in the dark, waiting. Around 2 May, I heard faint footsteps outside my apartment. My chest tightened as they grew louder, stopping just outside my door. I held my breath, clutching my phone. A soft knock broke the silence. 3 slow, deliberate taps. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. After a long pause, the footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. I stayed up the rest of the night, every creak of the building making my skin crawl. The next morning, I found another note slipped under my door. It read, "You're smart to stay quiet." My hand shook as I held the paper. He was toying with me, enjoying the fear he'd planted. I knew I couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change. I took a week off work and stayed at a friend's place across town. It felt safe for a while, but the paranoia didn't leave. Every stranger on the street, every passing car, felt like a potential threat. The fear had rooted itself deep in my mind. On the last night of my stay, I received a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of my apartment door, taken recently. My blood ran cold as I realized he'd been there while I was gone. The message that followed was simple: "Miss you." I showed the text to my friend, who insisted we call the police again. This time, they sent an investigator to my apartment. He found no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing to trace back to the man. "He's careful," the investigator said grimly, "but he'll slip up." I decided to move, breaking my lease and leaving the city entirely. I chose a small town 3 hours away, hoping to start fresh. The first few weeks were peaceful. I didn't take public transit, avoided social media, and kept my routines unpredictable. For a while, it felt like I had escaped. But one night, as I was unpacking a box, I heard a knock at the door. My heart raced as I approached cautiously. When I looked through the peephole, no one was there. But on the ground was a single folded note. Inside, it read, "Found you." I left the note where it was, backing away from the door. The man had followed me, proving there was nowhere I could hide. I didn't sleep that night, and I don't know if I ever will again. He's still out there, always one step behind, waiting for the right moment. Next story. The farmhouse wasn't much, but it was all I could afford after leaving the city. I needed a change, and the solitude of the countryside seemed like a solution. The closest neighbor was miles away, and the dirt road leading to the house was barely wide enough for a car. It was peaceful at first. The fields stretched endlessly in every direction, and the only sounds were the rustling of corn and the occasional cry of a hawk. I spent my days fixing up the place, cleaning years of grime from the old floors and patching the leaky roof. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I noticed movement at the edge of the field. At first, I thought it was a deer, but as I squinted, I realized it was a man, standing just beyond the rows of corn. He wasn't moving, just watching. I stepped onto the porch, shading my eyes against the fading light. "Can I help you?" I called out. The man didn't respond. He stood there for a moment longer before turning and disappearing into the corn. My stomach knotted as I scanned the rows, but he was gone. That night, I locked all the doors and windows, something I hadn't bothered to do since moving in. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a lost hiker or a local curious about the new resident. But I couldn't shake the image of him standing there, motionless. The next morning, I walked out to the edge of the field where I'd seen him. The ground was soft from last night's rain, and sure enough, there were footprints, large, heavy ones. They led straight to the spot where he'd stood, then veered off into the corn. I followed the prints for a while, but they disappeared deeper into the field. The stalks were tall, their dry leaves rustling in the wind. The air felt colder in there, heavier. I turned back, my skin crawling as I imagined unseen eyes watching me from the shadows. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but as the sun set, I felt the same unease creeping in. I kept the porch light on and checked the locks again. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a noise outside, soft, deliberate footsteps on the gravel. I grabbed the flashlight by my bed and crept to the window. The beam cut through the darkness, but I didn't see anything. The footsteps stopped, and the silence was deafening. My hand trembled as I locked the window and backed away. The next morning, I found something on the porch, a single muddy handprint smeared across the door. My chest tightened as I stared at it. Whoever had been outside last night had gotten close, too close. I called the local sheriff, but the response was underwhelming. "We get drifters through here sometimes," he said. "Probably nothing to worry about." He promised to send someone to check the area, but I could tell he didn't think it was serious. I felt foolish for being so scared, but the unease lingered. I decided to install cameras around the property. It took most of the day, but by evening, I felt a little safer. As I reviewed the live feed on my laptop, everything seemed normal. The fields were quiet, the only movement the swaying corn in the breeze. Around 2, a motion sensor alert buzzed. My heart pounded as I checked the feed. There he was, standing at the edge of the field again, his face hidden under a wide-brimmed hat. He didn't move, just stared toward the house. I grabbed my phone and dialed the sheriff's office, my voice trembling as I explained the situation. By the time the deputy arrived, the man was gone. The deputy shone his flashlight around but found no trace of him. "Probably just some weirdo," he said. "Call us if he comes back." The next few nights were quiet, but I couldn't relax. Every time I stepped outside, I felt like I was being watched. The cameras didn't pick up anything unusual, but the memory of his silent figure haunted me. I started sleeping with a knife under my pillow. One evening, as I walked back from the barn, I found something new on the porch, a bundle of corn husks tied together with twine. It looked like a crude doll, its head marked with what appeared to be charcoal eyes. My stomach churned as I picked it up. The sheriff came again, this time taking the doll as evidence. "Could be some kids playing a prank," he suggested, though his tone was less certain than before. I nodded, but deep down, I knew it wasn't kids. Whoever was doing this wanted me scared, and it was working. That night, I locked myself inside and kept the lights off, hoping to avoid drawing attention. Around midnight, the motion sensor buzzed again. My hand shook as I opened the feed. The man was closer this time, standing at the base of the porch steps. He raised a hand, pointing directly at the camera. My breath hitched as he stepped back into the shadows. The next morning, I found another bundle of corn husks on the porch, this one marked with what looked like smeared blood. My fear turned to anger. I decided to confront him. I waited that evening with a flashlight and a crowbar, watching the cameras intently. When he appeared at the edge of the field, I stepped outside, yelling, "Who are you? What do you want?" He didn't answer. He just turned and walked into the corn. I hesitated for a moment before following him into the corn. The rows were dense, and the dry leaves scratched at my arms as I pushed through. My flashlight beam wavered, illuminating only the endless stalks. "I know you're in here," I shouted, but my voice sounded small, swallowed by the field. The cornfield was eerily silent, save for the crunch of my boots on the soil. I strained to hear any movement but heard nothing. Just as I considered turning back, I saw something glint in the distance. I moved toward it cautiously, my grip tightening on the crowbar. The glint turned out to be a metallic object, an old, rusted lantern hanging from a wooden post. Beneath it lay another bundle of corn husks, this one larger and bound with barbed wire. My stomach turned as I noticed what looked like tufts of animal fur tangled in the wire. Suddenly, I heard movement behind me, a quick, rustling sound that sent my pulse racing. I swung the flashlight around, but the beam only revealed more corn. "Show yourself," I demanded, though my voice wavered. The rustling stopped, replaced by the faint sound of breathing. The breathing grew louder, closer. I spun in circles, trying to pinpoint its source. My flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, I felt a presence behind me. I whipped around, swinging the crowbar wildly, but hit nothing. The air felt heavy, oppressive. I stumbled backward, my flashlight cutting through the rows. Then I saw him, standing just a few feet away. His wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow over his face, but his grin was unmistakable. He held something in his hand, a long curved blade that gleamed in the faint light. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, my voice breaking. He didn't answer, just tilted his head like he was studying me. I backed away, keeping the crowbar between us. Then, without warning, he turned and vanished into the corn, his movements unnaturally smooth. I didn't follow. Instead, I ran, crashing through the rows until I reached the edge of the field. I stumbled onto the dirt road, gasping for breath. The farmhouse was a dark silhouette against the night sky, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a refuge. I locked myself inside and called the sheriff again, begging them to send someone immediately. To their credit, they arrived within 20 minutes, but by then, the man was long gone. The deputy searched the field but found nothing, not even the lantern or the bundle of husks. "You sure you saw someone?" one of the deputies asked, his tone skeptical. I nodded, my hands still trembling. "He was there. He's been here every night." The deputy sighed, writing something in his notebook. "We'll keep an eye on the area," he said. It wasn't enough. The next day, I packed a bag. I couldn't stay there any longer. As much as I hated to leave, the house didn't feel safe anymore. I planned to drive into town, find a motel, and figure out my next steps. But as I loaded my car, I noticed something chilling. A figure stood at the edge of the field, watching me. He didn't move, didn't react as I started the car. I drove away without looking back, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. In the rearview mirror, I saw him step onto the road, his shadow stretching under the rising sun. I stayed at a motel in town that night, the lights and locks offering some comfort. But even there, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every noise outside the door made my heart race. I barely slept, and when I finally did, I dreamed of the man in the hat. The next morning, I returned to the farmhouse with the sheriff, determined to gather the rest of my belongings. The field was empty, and everything seemed untouched. But when I stepped onto the porch, my blood ran cold. Another doll sat there, this one holding a note. The note read, "You can run, but you'll always be my guest." I left everything behind that day, driving as far as I could without looking back. I don't know where he came from or why he chose me, but I know one thing for sure: I'll never go back to the farm. Next story. It was supposed to be a quick overnight stay. I had driven 8 hours straight, making my way from Denver to Phoenix, and I needed sleep before finishing the trip. The motel was a last-minute choice, the Willow Creek Inn. Its faded neon sign flickered weakly against the backdrop of a moonless night. The receptionist was an older man with tired eyes and a strained smile. "Room 306, he said, sliding a key across the counter. The room was upstairs, and I could already feel the exhaustion setting in. The motel was nearly empty, its parking lot sparsely populated with dusty cars. The hallway smelled of mildew, and the carpet was worn thin. Room 306 was at the end of the hall. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was functional but uninviting. A small bed, a desk, and a flickering TV. The only decoration was a crooked painting of a forest. I locked the door and wedged a chair under the handle, a habit I picked up from too many true crime podcasts. The bathroom light flickered ominously, but I was too tired to care. I set my bag down and collapsed onto the bed, letting out a heavy sigh. Sleep didn't come easily. The mattress was stiff, and the pillow smelled faintly of bleach. Just as I started to drift off, I heard something, a faint scraping sound. It was coming from the door. My eyes snapped open, and I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound stopped, and I told myself it was nothing. Probably just the wind or the old building settling. I closed my eyes again, but then came a soft knock. 3 deliberate taps. I froze. It was nearly 2 who would be knocking at this hour? "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. The silence that followed was deafening. I stared at the door, the chair wedged tightly against it. After a few moments, I got up and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I tried to shake off the unease and returned to bed. Just as I started to feel my eyelids droop, the knocking came again, this time louder. My heart raced as I crept toward the door. I checked the peephole again, still no one. But then I noticed something chilling. There was a small piece of paper wedged under the door. I hesitated before pulling it out. In shaky handwriting, it read. My stomach twisted. I grabbed my phone to call the front desk, but there was no signal. The motel Wi-Fi was also down. I debated leaving immediately, but decided against it. I was too tired to drive, and the idea of walking through the dark parking lot was terrifying. Instead, I sat by the window, watching the empty lot below. The shadows seemed to shift with the wind, but no one appeared. The next hour passed in tense silence. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, and stopped just outside my door. My pulse pounded in my ears as I gripped the chair. The footsteps didn't move away. Whoever it was, they were just standing there. Finally, I mustered the courage to speak. "I'm calling the police," I shouted, though it was a bluff. The footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. My legs felt like jelly as I sank onto the bed. I kept the light on, too scared to close my eyes. Morning came slowly. The pale light of dawn seeped through the curtains, bringing a sense of relief. I packed my bag in a hurry, eager to leave. As I stepped into the hallway, I noticed something strange. The other doors had fresh scratches near the locks. I made my way to the front desk to check out. The receptionist from the night before was gone, replaced by a young woman. "How was your stay?" she asked, her tone cheerful. I hesitated before mentioning the strange events of the night. Her smile faltered. "We don't usually rent out room 306, she said, her voice lowering. "It's been empty for a while." My skin prickled. "I stayed there last night," I replied, showing her the key. Her face turned pale. "That's not possible." The room's been under maintenance for months. I felt a wave of nausea as she handed me a different key, identical to the one I'd used. "Where did you get this?" she asked. I couldn't answer. Without another word, I left the motel, my heart racing. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. 2 hours into my drive, I stopped at a diner for coffee. My hands trembled as I recounted the night to the waitress, hoping to make sense of it. She listened intently, her brow furrowing. "Willow Creek?" she asked. "That place shut down years ago." I froze. "What do you mean?" I asked. She explained that the motel had been closed after a series of violent incidents involving guests. It was abandoned now, a local ghost story. My coffee grew cold as I processed her words. Was it a mistake? A prank? I decided to turn back, desperate for answers. When I reached the site, my blood ran cold. The neon sign was gone, and the building was boarded up. The parking lot was overgrown with weeds, and there was no sign of life. It was as if the night before had never happened. As I stood there, a chill ran down my spine. On the ground near the front steps was a small piece of paper. I picked it up, my hands trembling. In the same shaky handwriting, it read, "You shouldn't have come back." I dropped it and ran to my car, my mind racing. I drove away without looking back, vowing to put the experience behind me, but the memories lingered. Every night I double-checked my locks and left the lights on. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever had been in room 306 wasn't done with me yet. Months later, I received an envelope in the mail. There was no return address. Inside was a single photograph of the motel, taken at night. Room 306's window glowed faintly, as if someone were inside. Scribbled on the back of the photo was a single word: "Stay."